Do you remember we've been saying for a while that Christians are very good at adding pressures to ourselves. Preachers will do it. We'll do it to ourselves. We'll do it to others. We'll create extra pressures to put on ourselves. And what I've tried to say recently is that we do it in three ways. We've created the pressure to be better than we are. And this is a pressure in relation to sin. So we think we should be doing better than we are doing. Preachers will often tell us that we should be doing better than we're doing. And that word should is key. And I tried to address that pressure by looking at Galatians 2, verses 18 to 21, where Paul sets out our identity as Christians and our relationship to Christ. And if we have a very clear sense of identity, that we had or have three ways of thinking of ourselves: the old, which is dead, the future, which is yet to come, but the now, which is a life of weakness. And in the now life, we have the grace of God and our relationship with Christ. Then that should be enough to take that pressure off that we often feel to be better. The second pressure that we are very good at putting ourselves under is the pressure in relation to faith. We've even got a phrase for it, haven't we? The phrase is that we should have faith in challenging or difficult circumstances. We said last Sunday night, it's the have and have view of faith. We have faith because we're Christians, but we are to have it, and I hate doing this, we are to have it in those moments of tension or difficulty. So we put that pressure on ourselves. And last Sunday, I started to think about that, looking at Hebrews 11 and that first verse. We saw there that faith isn't something we are to have. Faith has been given to us by God as the evidence, the proof of the things we can't see and the things that we are hoping for. Faith is a top-down, God-given thing that serves for us as the proof we need of those things that we can't touch and we can't see. Now, I want to carry on tonight building on that idea of faith, but just to complete what we're saying, the third pressure that we put on ourselves is the pressure to be different. This is a pressure in relation to evangelism, that when we are talking to somebody who's not a Christian, we feel the pressure to say something, something about Christ, and the pressure then shows itself in our conversations. We want to talk about how different we are, and often that comes across very negatively. We don't do certain things, or we don't go certain places. So there's a pressure that we feel there, that we should somehow be different and even better to non-Christian people. We'll talk about that one again. Let's think tonight then about this pressure in relation to faith, the pressure that we often think we should have faith when we are facing challenging situations. I want to look at this now from Ephesians 2, verses 8 to 10. First thing to do is just make our way through these verses and look at what Paul is saying to us, okay? So Ephesians 2, 8 through to 10. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. So let's make our way through each of these verses in turn. Verse 8, for by grace. Now this word grace that we've got in verse 8, in its form that we find in verse 8 only appears here. And we could say that the Greek word is translated in English as charity. By charity, by a complete act of undeserving mercy, we have been saved. There is no merit in us. There is nothing that we contribute. It's a free and totally gracious act of God, our salvation. But let's take the word our out and put in the word the. So the salvation, that which Jesus has achieved and accomplished, is an expression of the undeserving love and mercy of God. It is a free act of goodness on the part of God, the salvation which Jesus has accomplished. The question is, how does that become mine? How do I benefit from the life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus Christ? All his accomplishments, that salvation that he's achieved, how does that become mine? And the answer is through faith. Faith is the means by which what Christ has accomplished is applied to me. How I benefit or how I receive what Jesus has done. Okay, so there are two things here. There's Jesus himself and the salvation for sinners, but there's me, my part. How do I, and these are where you struggle, you know, how do I receive it, or how do I benefit from it? How do I get linked to the salvation that Jesus has accomplished? And that's where faith comes in. The Greek term means instrument of, or the link of faith. So look again at the verse. For by a free act of God's love, you have been saved through faith, by means of faith. Faith is the link, faith is the rope that ties us, that binds us into the salvation that Jesus has accomplished. Without faith, he would have achieved salvation, but that would not have then been applied to individuals. So faith is the connection. Let's have a horrible word, okay? Faith is the conduit through which the salvation reaches down to me. That's the first phrase in verse 8. Then Paul says this, that not of yourselves, it is a gift of God. Now, the big debate here, everyone, is what does that refer to? The word that. Look at verse 8 again. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. So that can refer to salvation. That could also refer to the faith that Paul is discussing, okay? Now, what we have to decide is what does that, the word now I mean, what does it refer? And it seems to me that it refers to both, okay? So the salvation is the gift of God, but the faith also is the gift of God. Both are the gift of God. Can I just say one word on gift? Okay, look at verse 8. That not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. the word gift is very unusual in the Greek language. And it can also refer to sacrifices. And the word, when it's used, usually refers to the gifts and the sacrifices a person offers to God. So if you think of the Greek world or the Roman world, this word douron would be used of the worshippers going in the temple and offering their meats and their money to God. Okay, it's what we give to God. Now, Paul here totally turns it around, and he says the Christian message is a message of God giving gifts to men and women. Can you see the great difference between the Christian message and all other religions? Other religions talk about us offering to God. The Christian message is God offering gifts to us. And in this context, we have two gifts. We have the gift of salvation, and we have the gift of faith. Both of these are the gifts or the offerings God makes to us. Now we know, don't we, just for the sake of completeness, that in 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about Christ as the indescribable gift. But here in verse 8, it is this sacrificial giving, okay? A giving at a cost. God has given us salvation, and he's given us the faith that links that salvation to us, that causes us to benefit, okay? It's not of ourselves. The salvation is not of ourselves. The faith is not of ourselves, but also, everyone, God's giving is not of ourselves. God doesn't sacrificially give to us in response to anything in ourselves. There is not a scrap in us that causes God to give sacrificially to us. And this gift is a sacrifice, okay? It's a costly gift. It cost God his only Son that he should then be able to gift us salvation and gift us faith, okay? But not of ourselves. That's verse 8. Now, verse 9 says the latter part of verse 8 again, okay? It's a repetition. Verse 9, not of works, lest anyone should boast. I'm going to pause, okay? Draw a deep breath, as I often do, and try and say to you that that key phrase, lest anyone should boast, is decisive in our understanding of having faith, as we've been describing it. So let's do something I never usually do, and let's give an illustration. Let's imagine two families, both Christian families, and they're both going on their holidays. They're going to separate places, but they're both going on their holidays. Both families have faith, as we say, the phrase we are discussing. They have faith that their holidays are going to go well. They've prayed, they've done what we call committing themselves to God, and off they go. Now, for the sake of our story, one family's holiday goes perfectly well, and the other family's holiday is a complete disaster. Let's imagine what that disaster is. You know, they arrive at the wrong hotel, and I don't know, the room is a disaster, they get food poisoning, whatever it is, okay? Both Christian families, they've both had faith, they've both wanted a good holiday, they both prayed, and so on. Now, this phrase, having faith, that phrase we're discussing now, you know, the pressure to have faith in life circumstances, if that is true, how do we understand these two families? Because they both had faith. Are we to say that the one goes well because the faith they had was more effective, more faithful than the other? Or do we say the family whose holiday didn't go very well didn't have enough faith? They didn't have faith even, you know? How are we meant to understand it? Now, broaden it out a little bit, and we all know of Christian people who, on journeys, facing illnesses, facing traumatic situations, have sought to have faith. And by that, they have meant that they have believed God will deliver them from it or keep them safe in it. And it hasn't happened. Disaster has struck. How do we understand this? If the phrase to have faith is correct, then we must find fault with Christians when things go wrong for them. We must. Because if having faith is what we are saying it is, having faith in a circumstance, in a trial, in a challenge, that God would save you from it or deliver you or keep you, if that is the case, then something's gone wrong for these people, isn't it? And something's gone wrong for their faith. Now, of course, I don't believe this at all. I think this is a complete misunderstanding of this phrase. In fact, the phrase itself is a complete misunderstanding. But if you look at verse 9 and the end of verse 9, that to me is the clincher. If having faith, you know, here I go again, flapping my arms. If having faith in a trial, in a challenge, means I will successfully come through it, then I've got the right to boast. I've got the right to make a claim that my faith has brought me through something. I can therefore say that something about me and what I did brought about my safety or brought about the fact that it's gone well. Can you see this now, okay? It's the opposite of what Paul is arguing here. Faith and grace mean there is no room for boasting. There is no room for boasting in the experience of salvation, but there is no room for boasting in the experience of faith. And the word boasting is one of Paul's great words, as you know. It can mean to glorify, but boasting can also mean to promote. It can mean to show or declare. It can mean to put on display. So if I have had faith that my holiday goes well, and it goes well, then I can then say, look, I'm putting on display, I'm showing you all that my faith was a decisive feature in that. Well, not according to Paul. There is no room for boasting. And when we think about people, Christians over the centuries, it's so easy, isn't it, for a person to start being elevated above the rest of us when we talk about their faith. And certain people then can have a special status because of their experience of faith. There is a boasting element. Now look again at verse 9. Salvation is not of works. Faith is not of works. It is all of grace. The word works means effort, self-effort in any way, any form. It's not of works, lest anyone should boast. So I'm being very brave. I can be braver perhaps through the Zoom thing that we're doing than I would normally be. I don't know, perhaps not. I want us to see that whenever we use the phrase, oh, have faith, oh, I must have faith right now, all we are really doing there is creating pressure and putting pressure on ourselves or on others if we say to others that they are to have faith. And it would be something I would really, really love to see in all of us, including myself, if we all stop doing this. Okay? Faith is not a thing you have in a moment. Faith is the gift of God, a sacrificial giving of God to us, which unites us, that's the word, unites us to what Christ has achieved. Okay, one more verse to go, verse 10. And what I want you to see in verse 10 is that Paul, he almost flips the coin over now to give us the other side, okay? So the one side of the coin is salvation and faith is the gift of God. Salvation and faith is the charitable, undeserving mercy of God that excludes works. It excludes works of faith. It excludes all kinds of works. That's the one side of the coin. Then Paul in verse 10 flips the coin over and he says, look at the other side of the coin. You are God's workmanship. So works are here, but it's God's works that are here, not our works, not even our works of faith, if there is such a thing. It is God's works, okay? For we are his workmanship. It is God who works, not us who works. Created in Christ Jesus. So it might sound obvious, but the word created there is linked to the idea of the creator. So Paul in verse 10 is taking us back into Genesis. And he's saying, now think now, he's saying, God created the universe. God created Adam in the garden. And in that act of creation, Adam went wrong and Adam sinned. Now, says Paul, God has created again. He's not created a garden. He's created you and me as Christian people. We are the new creation of God. And the great difference in this new creation is that God has already prepared the ways in which we live. God has already prepared all that we are going to do and every step that we take, that we will walk in it. So the reference to good works there, can you see it? We are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works. The idea there is we can't go wrong like Adam did. We are the new creation, and the new creation has been worked out by God. It's been pre-planned by God. Step by step by step, it's been ordained by God, and God will enable us to walk in it. God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. It's really, to me, it's a wonderful idea. It's a great image. It's a perfectly wonderful thing, Paul says. But as always, the challenge is for us to grasp it, okay? So you may not, I may not, but I'm going to do my best to help you to grasp it, okay? So it's almost like I'm going to put a line under what I've said so far and just do a bit of repetition, like the Bible does. If I was to have faith and bring about by having faith, I'm creating things. I'm the source of achieving things. I'm the grounds on which things then work out. I, in a challenging situation, have faith, and the result of that is that it works out. If I didn't have that faith, and if I hadn't had faith, then things might not have worked out. So I become the grounds, the basis, my action becomes the basis on which something goes well or it doesn't. Now that can't be right, can it? That just cannot be right. That doesn't fit at all with our understanding of what salvation is, what grace is, what the walk of faith is. It just doesn't fit. Paul is saying it's the exact opposite. God has already worked out the good things in our lives. He's already worked out the good works, the occasions, the happenings, the events, the circumstances. God has already worked them out beforehand. God has already planned each event of our lives beforehand. What he then simply wants us to do is walk in it. So back to our two families. God had already worked out beforehand that the one family will have a great holiday and the other family will have a disaster. He'd already worked it out. He'd prepared beforehand for it. He simply asks his people to walk in it, to walk in the ways that he has prepared beforehand. So, change my picture, my kind of analogy. When was it now? Storm Dennis. Doesn't that seem like a lifetime ago? Some of you may know that 3 a.m. on the Sunday of Storm Dennis, our house was kind of at risk of flooding. Do you remember? The water was coming into the back and it was coming into our garage and it was coming down the steps of our garage. It comes into our sink. And if Tracy hadn't woken up at 3 a.m., then it would have got worse and the whole situation would have been much more challenging than it was. Okay, so Tracy and I, Will and Julie, we were out at 3 o'clock in the morning, sweeping and doing all we could to try and stop the water coming in. Okay, now in that situation, with my pajamas on and my wellies on and my umbrella and my sweeping brush, if I had faith that we weren't going to get flooded, would that have made any difference? And of course the answer is no. It shouldn't even have been a thought in my head to have faith in those circumstances. What Paul is saying to us here, and it is a lot to take in, what Paul is saying to us is God had worked that out before. God had prepared beforehand that work. And all that God does is good. So God had prepared that work, that flood, that challenge, that 3 a.m. wake up. God had prepared it all before. And what he required of us was to walk in it. And to walk in it by the grace that he gives, by the resurrection power that is at work in our lives every day, by the power of God, by the providence of God, by the sovereignty of God, to walk in it in the knowledge that it wasn't my work of faith that would have saved the day. It was a great God over and above it all. That's what Paul is saying, okay? God had also worked out beforehand that there would be a storm. God had also worked out beforehand that most of you had no flooding at all. God had worked it all out beforehand. You may know that I got a very dreadful record of car crashes, and I have. I haven't had one for, 3 years or so, but I've had a fair amount over the years. Were those car crashes because I didn't have faith that I'd have a safe journey? Or was it just simply that I'm a dreadful driver? You know, what is it? There's a very famous story from the Middle Ages of a priest in a church, and the church was full of people. And during the service, the roof collapsed. And afterwards, he was known to have said to, whoever, "Oh, my faith remains intact. I'm able to maintain my faith even after a terrible tragedy." Now, of course, what should have been told to him was he should have maintained his roof rather than trying to maintain his faith, you know? The idea of all that I'm trying to say to you is this. In our understanding of God, if we are deeply grounded in our understanding, first of all, of the sovereignty of God, his providence, that he is over all, that he ordains all, then that will carry us through. And he has ordained all the happenings, the events, the works, because the word means to do, to act. He has ordained them all, and because he's ordained them all, they're all good. He wants us to walk in them, simply to walk through them as a result of his beforehand planning. Faith connects us to the salvation that Jesus has achieved. Faith is our link to the accomplishments of Christ. Faith is that which unites us to who Jesus is and to what he has achieved. Faith is not the link to the events of life. Faith is not the link to God through the events of life. Faith is that which unites us to Christ so that his accomplishment becomes ours. What has happened to him happens to us. What is true of him becomes true of us. That's where faith unites. Faith links us that way, not this way somehow to God through the challenges of our existence. What unites us to God through the challenges of our existence is our understanding of God, that he has planned them all, worked them out before, that he then simply calls us to walk in it. That's what I'm trying to work out with us all. If we get to see it, then my great hope is we take a huge amount of pressure off us. That when it comes to the challenges of life, it's who God is and our understanding of him that will carry us through, that will help us to walk through. Not some momentary pressure we then put on ourselves to have something. Just to try and reinforce it, and then I'm going to stop. If you go back to verse 10, and if you try to make out good works there to be something you've got to do, like charity or evangelism or missionary or ministering or something, if you try to work out that that's what good works means, then think of the Christians who never seem to do anything good. And there's loads of Christians who've never done anything, have they? They've never done any kind of achievement or any kind of sacrificial giving. They've not done a thing. So what did God do there then? Did he give them nothing to do? You see, this isn't about us. We fall into that mistake all the time of thinking that we are reading about us. The good works of verse 10 are God's works. All that he has planned before. The clue is in the verse. We are his workmanship, created, he's the creator, in Christ Jesus, for the good works, which God has ordained. The works that God has planned out before. And they're good because he's done them. That we should, what's our responsibility? We should just walk in them. The word is the word peripatetic. We should just walk around them, walk through them. Okay, that's what God calls us to do. So, final statement, faith connects us to Christ, and we have faith in the real biblical sense of the term because it is God's gift. It is God's charitable act. God sacrificially gifted you faith to unite you to Christ, and that we may then have his salvation. The life bit, the living bit, is us living through the things that God has prepared beforehand, that we should walk in them.